The folder hit her in the chest and burst open in the air. 11 months of work, sworn statements, bank traces, contract numbers, photographs, came apart over the conference table and rained down across the floor, and the man who'd thrown it was already on his feet, leaning over her, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "Pick it up," Colonel Marcus Hargrove said. Captain Sloane Reyes did not move. "I said pick it up, Captain. On your knees. Every page. And while you're down there, you can think real hard about whether 11 months of your little hobby is worth what it's about to cost you." There were 7 other people in that room. 2 from the colonel's staff. A garrison legal officer. 3 members of a review panel who'd flown in that morning. And a stenographer, frozen with her fingers over the keys. 7 witnesses. And not one of them said a word. Not one of them stood. They studied the table, the windows, their own hands, the way people do when a powerful man is doing something ugly, and the smart career move is to have seen nothing at all. So that's the room. Remember it. A captain with a colonel screaming into the side of her face, 11 months of evidence scattered across the floor like trash, and 7 people deciding all at once that the safest thing in the world is to look away. And under the table, something moved. The Doberman had been lying at her feet the whole time, black and tan, still as furniture, the kind of still that people mistake for asleep. He was not asleep. He had been awake every second, reading the room the way he read everything, and when the folder struck her chest he had lifted his head, and when the colonel said on your knees he had risen, slow to a low crouch, and now, as Hargrove leaned in another inch, the dog came up to his full standing height and put himself between the captain's chair and the colonel's body. He did not growl. He did not bare a tooth. He did not make a single sound. He just stood there, all of him, hackles lifting along his spine, amber eyes locked on the colonel's face, and Marcus Hargrove, 30 years in uniform, a man who had never once been told no, took a step back from a dog that hadn't made a sound. Because the dog had already said it. Clearly. Completely. No. And then Captain Sloane Reyes said it too. Out loud. Quiet. One word, into a silent room. No. She didn't get on her knees. She reached down, slow, unbothered, one hand resting for a second on the dog's shoulder, easy, and she picked up exactly 1 page off the floor. Just 1. She set it flat on the table, turned it so the panel could read it right side up, and slid it the length of the wood toward the 3 officers who'd flown in to watch her fold. It was a copy of a contract award, and stapled to the corner of it was a second document, an order, signed in the colonel's own hand, directing the destruction of the originals. "That's the one I'd start with, sir," she said. To the panel. Not to him. "There are 40 more on the floor. He just threw them at me in front of 7 witnesses and a court reporter. I'd recommend nobody touch them until they've been photographed exactly where they lie." The stenographer's fingers came down on the keys. And Colonel Marcus Hargrove understood, 2 seconds too late, that he had just performed the single most documented mistake of his career, in a room full of people on the record with a transcript running, because he had spent the whole morning making one wrong assumption, the same assumption every man like him makes, the one that always costs them everything. He thought quiet meant weak. He thought a soft-spoken woman with a service dog would get on her knees and pick up the truth 1 page at a time and hand it back to him cleaned and signed and harmless. He thought the math was simple. Throw your weight, raise your voice, threaten the dog and the career and the pension, and watch her fold the way quiet people fold. In Marcus Hargrove's 30 years, quiet had always meant weak, and weak had always meant manageable. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Because the quiet was not weakness. The quiet was the sound a person makes when they have already decided long ago, in a place no colonel can reach, exactly what their name is worth, and exactly what it will never be for sale to do. Her name was Captain Sloane Reyes. The dog's name was Judge. And the folder he'd thrown at her chest didn't hold the clean report he'd ordered her to sign. It held the real one. To understand how a captain ends up taking a colonel's evidence to the chest in a sealed hearing room, with a Doberman rising silent at her side and 7 people too scared to breathe, you have to back up. You have to understand the room. And you have to understand why she was never, ever going to get on her knees. So let's back up. It had started 11 months earlier as the most boring thing in the world. A routine financial review, garrison contracting at a mid-sized installation. Vehicle maintenance, facilities, the unglamorous machinery that keeps a base running. The kind of audit handed to a CID captain not because anyone expects to find anything, but because the regulation says someone has to look. And Sloane Reyes was very, very good at looking. That was the thing her superiors valued and her targets always missed. She didn't look like much across a table, and she saw everything. What she saw, 3 weeks in, was a number that didn't sit right. What she saw, 3 weeks in, was a number that didn't sit right. A contract for vehicle maintenance, routine, recurring, the kind of thing that gets renewed every year without a second glance, had come in 11% over the previous cycle. 11%. Not enough to trip an alarm. Not enough for anyone above her to notice or care. Just enough to make a woman who'd spent her life noticing small wrong things stop, and go back, and look again. That's the thing about people like Hargrove. They never get caught on the big theft. The big theft is loud, and loud gets attention. They get caught, when they get caught at all, on the small things. The 11%. The vendor whose address is a mailbox. The contract awarded 3 times to the same company under 3 slightly different names. The signature that appears on an approval dated a day the approving officer was provably 4 time zones away. Sloane Reyes found all of it. Not in a week. Over 11 months. One small wrong thing at a time, each one boring on its own, each one nothing, until you laid them side by side on a wall and stepped back, and the shape of it appeared all at once, the way a face appears in a crowd once you know who you're looking for. The shape was a colonel. A garrison commander who had spent 6 years quietly steering maintenance and facilities contracts to a small constellation of shell companies. Companies that did some of the work, sometimes, badly, and billed for all of it, always. The money came back to him laundered through consulting fees and a brother-in-law's logistics firm, and a boat registered in a state he'd never lived in. Not a fortune. That was the discipline of it. He never got greedy enough to be obvious. Just a steady, patient skim off the top of the machine he'd been trusted to run. Year after year, contract after contract, while the trucks his soldiers drove came back from the shop with the same problems they'd gone in with. That last part was the part that got under her skin. Sloane Reyes had read a lot of fraud cases by then, and she'd made a private peace with most of them. People steal. Money disappears. The world keeps turning. But there was a maintenance report in the file buried routine, about a tactical vehicle that had failed an inspection 3 times and been signed off as repaired 3 times by a shop that, on paper, had been paid $40,000 to fix it and had, in fact, done nothing at all. Nobody had been hurt. This time. That was luck, not Hargrove. And she'd looked at that report for a long while, alone late, the dog asleep at her feet, and she'd thought about the kind of man who calls that an acceptable margin. She might have said, if she said things like that out loud. He wasn't a thief in the way that makes a good story. He was something quieter and worse. He was a man who decided, somewhere along the way, that the people under him were a line item. She built the case the way she built everything. Slowly. Completely. No leaks, no shortcuts, no telling anyone above her until she had it sealed. Because she'd been doing this long enough to know that the moment a case like this gets political, it stops being a case and starts being a negotiation. So she waited. She documented. She made copies of her copies and kept one set somewhere that wasn't her office and wasn't her home and wasn't on any network with the Army's name on it. And then, 11 months in, with the file all but closed, Colonel Marcus Hargrove found out anyway. Here's how power actually works, by the way, not in the movies, in the rooms. He didn't threaten her first. Men like Hargrove almost never lead with a threat. He invited her to dinner. A nice one. He praised her work, her thoroughness, her future. Leaned on that word, future, the way a man leans on a door he's checking is unlocked. He talked about how the Army eats its careful people, how the smart ones learn which fights are worth it, how a woman with her instincts could write her own ticket if she understood that some doors open and some doors close, and the trick, the only trick that matters, is knowing which is which before you walk through. She let him talk. She always let them talk. People who underestimate you will hand you everything if you just stay quiet long enough to let them. And under the table, where he couldn't see, Judge lay across her feet, warm and still, and she rested the toe of one boot against his side, and she listened to a colonel explain, in the gentlest possible terms, that her case was about to disappear, and she had a choice about whether her career disappeared with it. She thanked him for dinner. She drove home. And the next morning she requested the formal review hearing herself, pulled the trigger before he could, got it on the calendar, got the 3 outside panel officers flown in, got it on the record, because the one thing a man like Hargrove cannot survive is daylight, and the one weapon she had that he couldn't take away was the simple act of making everyone look. Which brings us to the dog. Because you're wondering, and you should be. A CID captain doesn't typically walk into a hearing with a Doberman. So let me tell you about Judge, and let me tell you the part she never put in any file. 3 years before any of this, Sloane Reyes had been the one being investigated. Not for fraud. For a shooting. A night raid gone wrong, an investigation she'd been part of that turned violent in a doorway, a teammate down, a decision made in 3/4 of a second that the official report, written, as these reports so often are backward, from the conclusion the brass needed to the explanation that got them there, had quietly hung around her neck. She'd been cleared. Technically. The kind of cleared that leaves you with your rank and your career and a thing behind your eyes you don't get back. The kind of cleared where everyone in the room knows the truth and the paper says something else and you learn, at a cellular level, exactly how it feels to be the one the system decides to spend. She didn't sleep for a year. And the army, in one of those rare moments where the machine does something human almost by accident, paired her with a dog. Judge had washed out of the military working dog program. Too independent, the trainers said, too willing to make his own call about who was a threat and who wasn't. A flaw, on paper. They were going to put him down. Somebody who owed somebody a favor rerouted him to a pilot program for handlers with combat stress. And Sloane Reyes drove 4 hours to a kennel to meet a dog the army had given up on. And a dog the army had given up on looked at a captain the army had quietly spent, and something passed between them that neither one ever needed to explain. He'd slept at the foot of her bed every night since. He read rooms before she walked into them. He knew the difference between a man who was angry and a man who was dangerous, and he'd never once been wrong. The trainers had called that a flaw. She called it the only honest opinion she'd had in 3 years. So when Hargrove sat across that dinner table and made his gentle little offer, and then when she didn't fold, threatened to take the dog, to use the budget rules and the transfer to pull Judge off her rolls and send her north alone, he hadn't found her weak spot. He'd found the one threat in the entire world that guaranteed she would never ever sign. Because she'd been the one the system decided to bury once already. She knew exactly what that backward-written report felt like from the inside. And she had made a promise to herself, somewhere in that sleepless year, with a washed-out dog breathing slow against her ribs in the dark, that she would never put her name on a single lie that buried somebody else the way they'd tried to bury her. He didn't know any of that. He saw a quiet woman and a dog and a budget line. He thought he was holding her leash. He had it exactly backward. He usually did. Which is how, 11 months after a number that didn't sit right, Captain Sloane Reyes walked into a sealed review hearing with 40 pages of truth in a folder and a Doberman at her side, and how Colonel Marcus Hargrove, watching her stay calm while he raised his voice, made the catastrophic decision to stop being gentle. He stood up. He picked up the folder off the table. And he threw it at her chest. We're back in the room now. You know the room. You know what the dog does. But here's what happened next. After the page slid down the table, after the stenographer's fingers came down on the keys, after a colonel took a step back from a dog that hadn't made a sound. Because the 3 officers on that panel had flown in that morning believing they were there to do Marcus Hargrove a favor. And one of them had just watched him throw evidence at a federal investigator on the record. Because the 3 officers on that panel had flown in that morning believing they were there to do Marcus Hargrove a favor. That's how it had been arranged. Quietly. A friend with stars makes a call to a friend with stars, and a routine review gets staffed with the right people. People who understand how these things go, who know that an overeager investigator is a problem to be managed, who'd come to put a soft and final end to Captain Reyes and her 11-month hobby and send everybody home by lunch. That was the plan. And for about 4 minutes, it was working. And then a colonel threw 40 pages of evidence at a federal investigator, on the record, in front of a court reporter, and told her to get on her knees. You could see the moment it turned. Not in him. Hargrove was still standing, still breathing hard, still certain the room belonged to him the way every room always had. It turned in them. In the panel. The senior officer of the 3 was a brigadier general named Aldous Carr, a man who had spent a long career being very careful about which favors he did and which he didn't, and Carr was looking down at a single page that a quiet captain had slid the length of the table, a contract award, and stapled to it, an order to destroy the originals, signed in Hargrove's own hand. Carr was no crusader. Let's be honest about that. He hadn't flown in to save anybody. But there's a line that even careful men won't cross, and the line is this: you can do a friend a quiet favor in a sealed room, but you will not put your own name on the transcript next to the words he threw the evidence and told her to kneel. Not with a stenographer running. Not when the truth is sitting photographed on the floor where 40 pages landed. Carr hadn't come to be a hero. He'd come to be invisible. And Hargrove, in 4 loud minutes, had just made invisible impossible for everyone in the room. "Sit down, Colonel," Carr said. Hargrove didn't. "General, this woman has been conducting an unauthorized." I said sit down. And here's the thing about men like Marcus Hargrove, the thing that took him 30 years to never learn: their power was never theirs. It was lent. It was the room agreeing to pretend. The medals, the rank, the gravity, all of it ran on the quiet consent of everyone around him to look away. And the second that consent broke, the second one man with more stars decided the cost of the favor had just gotten higher than the cost of the truth, Hargrove had nothing left at all. He'd spent 30 years mistaking the room's permission for his own strength. He sat down. Carr turned to the captain. "Captain Reyes, you said there are 40 more pages on the floor." "41, sir." "Calm. Quiet." The dog still standing at her side, easing now, the hackle settling, amber eyes never quite leaving the colonel. "And a sealed duplicate set, off-site, with a chain of custody that doesn't run through this installation or anyone on it. I'd request the room be secured and the documents photographed in place before anyone touches them." "You came in here expecting this." "I came in here," she said, ready for it. "There's a difference, sir." Hargrove tried once more. He was good, I'll give him that, the way you give a thing its due. He pivoted, smooth, reasonable, the fatherly voice back in place. This was a misunderstanding. Emotions had run high, surely cooler heads, and you could watch him reaching for the old gravity, expecting the room to swing back toward him the way it always had. The room didn't swing. Who challenges a colonel in his own hearing? That's the question the old version of this room would have asked. The version where quiet means weak and rank means right, and the careful men always look away. But that room was gone. It had died the moment a folder left his hands. And the new room, the one with the stenographer's keys clicking steady, and a general who decided to be on the record, and a captain who'd never once raised her voice, that room already knew the answer. The one who challenges a colonel is the one who came ready. The one who made copies of her copies. The one who understood that the only weapon a powerful man can't take from you is daylight. They secured the room. They photographed the floor. And Captain Sloane Reyes walked out of that hearing with her career intact and her dog at her side, and Colonel Marcus Hargrove walked out of it into the first day of the rest of what was coming. Here are the cold facts, because the facts are the point. The investigation Hargrove tried to bury was reopened that afternoon, this time with a 4-stars office watching, because nobody wanted to be the next name attached to it. The 41 pages held. The off-site duplicates held. The chain of custody she'd built so carefully, the one that ran through no one on that base, held like iron. It took 14 months. Marcus Hargrove was convicted at General Court-Martial on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction. 6 years of stolen contracts. A shell company constellation that took forensic accountants the better part of a year to fully map. He was reduced in rank. He forfeited the pension he'd threatened her with, every dollar of it. He was dismissed from the service, which is the officer's word for a dishonorable discharge, the kind that follows a man into every room for the rest of his life. The boat got sold to pay restitution. The brother-in-law's logistics firm got its own indictment. And that maintenance report, the tactical vehicle failed 3 times, signed off 3 times, the $40,000 paid for work never done, that one got pulled out of the file and read into the record by name. Because nobody had been hurt. This time. And the panel wanted it understood on paper, exactly how close this time had come. Not a victory. Don't call it that. Sloane Reyes never did. It was just the thing that should have happened, finally happening, 11 months late, 14 months slow, and only because one person who'd already been buried once refused to help bury anyone else. She made major 18 months later. The promotion board, reviewing her file, found a captain who'd taken a folder to the chest and a threat to her career and a colonel's full weight, and had not signed. Had not knelt. Had slid 1 page down a table and let the truth do the rest. There are worse things to find in a file. And Judge, the dog the army had given up on, the one too willing to make his own call about who was a threat. The flaw they'd been ready to put down, Judge got something almost no working dog ever gets. A letter. An official one, entered into her record and his, recognizing his role. They made his status permanent. The independence the trainers had called a defect, the thing that made him rise without a command when a man leaned too close to his handler, that got written down, at last, as exactly what it was. The only honest opinion in the room. He still slept at the foot of her bed. He still read every room before she walked into it. And on her new desk, when she pinned on the gold oak leaves of a major, she kept one small thing where she could see it. Not a medal. Not a commendation. A nameplate. And on it, one word. No. One last thing, before you go. I've spent a long time around rooms like that one. Long enough to know how the trick really works, that a man like Hargrove was never as powerful as the room let him believe, that his whole career ran on everybody agreeing to look at the floor. And I've seen what happens to the ones who won't look at the floor. It usually costs them. Sometimes it costs them everything. The system does not love the person who makes it look. But every so often, not often but enough, the cost lands on the right man instead. Every so often the careful people in the room decide, all at once, that they will not put their names next to the lie. And it almost never happens because the system is good. It happens because somebody quiet, somebody who'd already been buried once and crawled back out, decided they would rather lose the career than sign the thing that buried somebody else. Sloane Reyes never raised her voice. Not once. She just refused to kneel, and she had a dog beside her who'd never been wrong about a dangerous man in his life. And somewhere out there, on a desk with gold oak leaves on the shoulders that pass it every morning, there's a nameplate with one word on it, the cheapest word in the language, and the most expensive thing she ever said. Say it when it counts. Even when the room is telling you to look at the floor. Especially then. I'll see you in the next one.